Good morning. On behalf of the NC Chamber, welcome to our first Ag Allies webinar of 2022, what every ag business needs to know about carbon markets. And I'm Peter Daniel with the North Carolina Chamber. All attendees are muted today to avoid any distractions during the presentation. If time permits, we will answer as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation. If you'd like to submit a question during the meeting, please use the question and answer box. Please do not use the chat box. A recording of today's webinar will be made available to you via email within 24 hours of the webinar. And now I would like to introduce Keith Larrick, Natural Resources Director of the North Carolina Farm Bureau. For the past 7 years at the NC Farm Bureau, Keith has worked with their public policy group to develop environmental policy for agriculture-related issues in North Carolina. Keith has spent a career in advocating for agriculture policy and supporting the ag industry in previous roles at the NC Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services and the NC Department of Environmental and Natural Resources. Keith, we enjoy partnering with your A+ team at the Farm Bureau, and the floor is yours. Looking forward to today's discussion.
Thanks, Peter, and I appreciate it. I'm Keith Larrick with North Carolina Farm Bureau. NC Farm Bureau is the state's largest agricultural organization, and we represent the interests of farmers in rural communities at the legislature and in DC and with state and federal regulatory agencies. Personally, I focus on environmental issues, and one topic that has gained a lot of interest in the past year or so is the issue of climate and carbon markets. As corporate America makes climate pledges, a lot of these companies are turning to these markets to help them meet those pledges. Me personally, and then at the state level at North Carolina Farm Bureau, we're trying to get up to speed on carbon markets and what that's going to mean for our farmers. One person that I turn to with a lot of these questions is one of my colleagues at American Farm Bureau, Shelby Myers. Shelby is an economist at the American Farm Bureau Federation with a focus on crop markets, farm policy, and sustainability markets. She and the rest of the economics team are responsible for tracking markets and examining the impact of various legislative and regulatory initiatives on agriculture. Shelby earned her bachelor's and master's degrees in agricultural economics from Purdue University with a research emphasis on agriculture policy and a thesis analyzing the Farm Bill. Before joining AFBF, she spent 4 years on the public policy team at Indiana Farm Bureau. Shelby was a 10-year 4-H member, showing sheep and dairy heifers. She recently concluded her appointment by USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue to serve on the USDA Advisory Committee on Beginning Farmers and Ranchers. Though currently living in Washington, D.C., Shelby and her husband, Isaac, are still engaged on the family farm in New Richmond, Indiana, where they raise corn and soybeans with beef cattle and custom sweet corn for a local distillery. Shelby, I will turn it over to you, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much, Keith, and thank you to the NC Chamber for having me. Excited to present this information for you all and hopefully bring some good information that you can use in every day. I know this is a hot topic, and for many reasons it is, and hopefully we can provide some context for you all and appreciate our bosses at North Carolina Farm Bureau and everything that you do on behalf of our membership. So I'll jump in and get started. I do always start this presentation off with a quick note. You're all going to laugh a little bit. I'm not a lawyer, but with Zoom, I feel like I play one on TV. I always put a disclaimer on this presentation that because this industry is moving so quickly and things are developing rapidly, what I present today might change next week. It might change in the month, or we might continue to be in a lull of information until we see some movement and traction in either the private or public space. But with that caveat, because things are changing, please be okay with some answers of, I don't know yet, I can't tell you yet, or it depends. And the part of I can't tell you is sometimes many of these developments are proprietary and we have to wait and see as those companies develop. The other thing I want to talk about and just kind of lay it out there is, yes, while these credit markets are the hot, shiny thing in the room right now, everybody wants to talk about them. I always emphasize for our farmer membership that carbon markets and ecosystem service markets are just one of the many options out there to incentivize in a voluntary market-based way conservation adoption. It just happens to me. I think, the caveat of those that are most curious and have the most questions about them tend to be the most talked about things. And I think that's the scenario that we're running into with these credit markets, that because there are so many questions, that's what gives them a lot of attention. But there are many other options out there for farmers to consider when it comes to adopting conservation, when we're talking about addressing some of the climate goals that are out there. And so want to make sure that we establish that up front, and you'll see a little bit more as to why I say that as we dive deeper. So to begin, as background, these are voluntary incentive-based national markets designed to bring buyers of credits together on one platform with the sellers who can generate them. And essentially that platform is called a MRV platform, a monitoring, reporting, verification platform. And we'll talk more about what that means, but that's kind of the basic level that we can talk about it at. Farmers who want to earn money selling these credits will have to opt into some form of data monitoring and measurement. And I stress that a lot for our growers because there are a couple of the contracts that ask for a very deep dive into a farm business's books, as well as receipts, data, information on farm data, all of that. And so ensuring that the contract that's set up is protective of farmers and ranchers is very important. Payments are going to come in two different ways. We have a pay for practice model, which is typically what we're used to when it comes to cost share and conservation. We've seen pay for practice throughout most of the USDA programs that we utilize, the Conservation Stewardship Program, EQIP, that Environmental Quality Incentives Program, and ASIP and regional conservation help enable some of those projects as well. But we typically see that. And so that's a payment based on per acre to implement a certain practice. And so you do see that a little bit out in these markets, but not as often as the other payment form, which is a pay for outcomes model. And that is strictly, they want to come out and measure the environmental benefit that has occurred from the practice implemented and pay based on the outcomes generated. So in the event of carbon sequestration, we're going to pay either based on the metric ton of carbon sequestered or the proprietary conversion rate that they have that converts the amount of metric tons into a credit, and they'll pay based on credit. So those are the two ways that you typically see some of these markets come about. Three magic words make these markets function. We first have certify, quantify, and verify. We have to certify that the practices that farmers and ranchers said they would implement actually happen, that they are agronomically correct for the targeted goals of whatever environmental benefit we're looking to do, as well as implemented correctly to the correct rates, all of that. Then we come out and we quantify that environmental benefit. That typically comes in the form of soil samples and satellite imagery, as well as field scouting. But we're going to take some soil samples, put that into the calibration model that generates the estimates of how much, again, carbon, for example, carbon that was sequestered, and generates that information. And then all of that goes off to the third-party verifier. And that is a very important piece because that third-party verifier ensures that the credit is credible before it goes on to the market. That verification piece, the reason it exists is because there is no number 2 yellow carbon out there. That does not exist. We lack standardization in this market right now. And so the third-party verification is what does that. But we've got a couple different organizations that are third-party verifiers. So as buyers are looking for which credit they want to purchase, they'll purchase based on the third-party verifier and the standards that that verification has set. So really important piece to this puzzle. The practices that we're talking about are not new, and frankly, they're not unique when it comes to work that a lot of farmers and ranchers have done. Many farmers and ranchers have implemented these practices already in some form or fashion. and maybe, for financial reasons or otherwise either couldn't keep it going or they have. But these are primarily the ones that we're talking about. And I know in many regions, the issue that we're starting to run into is, you look at the practice list on, say, the conservation stewardship program, and, geographically, there's probably 5 practices that work for that area and for that cropping system. And we've already exhausted those 5. So where do you go next in order to participate in some of these? And that's an emerging issue that we see, but for the most part, we're really targeted on looking for cover crops, nutrient management, no-till, strip-till, crop rotation, livestock rotation, buffer strips for many of the livestock industry, anaerobic digesters, and treat establishments. If I threw a lot at you and you're more of a visual learner, I do have this visual to try to help put the pieces together. On the left, we have where producer enrollment would occur. They're going to pick that NRCS-based practice. That's where NRCS is going to play a really important role in this, and that they are going to be the technical assistance providers that are free and available to farmers and ranchers on the ground to help pick those agronomically correct practices. And NRCS has a great resource on their website that talks about which practices for which cropping systems have a great range of ability to mitigate greenhouse gases, carbon, nitrous oxide, methane, and so on. So you're going to pick an NRCS practice. We've decided to opt into that data monitoring and measurement, and we're okay with where the contract is. We're going to sign a long-term contract. And I can't stress this enough of how important it is that agriculture understands what this means. This is going to be a huge cultural shift for our industry. We're used to, particularly rental contracts, being year-to-year contracts that are done on a handshake, or a quick phone call over coffee on a Sunday, that sort of thing. The nature of these long-term contracts is that if you are a tenant, you have to prove operational control over the entire duration of the contract that you're signing with this company over the ground that you want to implement it on. If you're a tenant of a trust, all of the trust members have to sign off as landowners that what this tenant is doing, they're okay with. And that obviously is going to create some conversations about payment schedules and who gets paid for what and how this works. Landowners can initiate this and ask this of their tenants. Typically in that scenario, it's, if you're not willing to do this, I'll find another tenant who is, and having those conversations. So huge change in what we're seeing, because many of these contracts, they're not 1 or 2 years. They're more like 5 or 10 or 30 years that you're committing to this. And so very different situation than what many agriculture producers are used to, and something to be aware of. So we've opted into that. We're applying the practice and starting to earn the environmental benefit that practice generates. We've quantified it, sent the information off, verified, brought it back to the market. Those credits are now credible to be sold to the buyers who are looking to meet sustainability commitments or compliance standards. Usually those sustainability commitments come from commitments they've made to stockholders or global entities. Maybe it's their global headquarters that are based in areas that need to meet compliance standards, or countries that need to meet those. Sometimes it's a consumer label that they're chasing after, that net zero label. And how they achieve that is typically we're focused on scope 1 and scope 3 emissions. Scope 1 emissions are direct emissions from that company. The building that they're hosted in goes from running on regular electricity to solar electricity, that sort of thing, reducing their emissions, however that turns out. Scope 3 emissions are emissions throughout the supply chain based on that product. And what the goal of these is, if that business can't control what happens at step 2 of their supply chain, as far as emissions reductions and whatnot, or it's just infeasible for them to reduce emissions further, whatever it may be, purchasing an offset credit that allows them then to offset that emissions and capture their goals for sustainability. All that to be said, they have the demand buyers have their reasons for purchasing, and then growers are paid on the back end after that transaction is made. So I have the words up there, agricultural asset and ecosystem services. And that's because we're not just talking about carbon, but carbon is the most common greenhouse gas and the most common market platform that you're going to find. The reason being is the demand driver in this market. If you look at transportation, they're 29% of US greenhouse gas emissions. Electricity is 25%, industry is 23%, all very carbon heavy when it comes to their emissions. Agriculture, on the other hand, represents about 10% of US greenhouse gas emissions. And if you combine the agriculture emissions with their ability to sequester carbon via crops and forestry, we're actually negative 2% in our greenhouse gas emissions. Agriculture tends to be more heavy on the nitrous oxide and methane emissions, and we don't emit a whole lot of carbon, but we sequester a whole lot of carbon. So those demand buyers in transportation, electricity, industry, commercial, all those other folks are looking at agriculture to say, you have what we need to offset where we can't find a way to streamline our emissions. And that's creating the supply and demand dynamics of this market. But everybody else looked at agriculture and said, the practices that we're implementing have the ability to have more than just one greenhouse gas mitigation impact. Let's see if we can find a way to stack those credits. And so not only can folks get paid for sequestering carbon, but they can get paid for the water quality improvements that they made, or the water quantity, their nutrient management, and the ability to get paid for those multiple benefits. And so that's why we're not just talking about carbon today. Credits can be purchased by corporations, like I mentioned earlier. And many agribusinesses are looking at implementing programs and purchases. There are governments, specifically municipalities, who are looking at some of those water quality credits and saying that's a really important piece for us in our ability to do water treatment and other municipality functions, and are wanting to streamline some techniques there. Many farmers are going to be paid in the form of either an input discount, depending on who they're working with, or just a general cash payment. And I'll explain a little bit more about what I mean, depending on who they're working with here in a second. The who and when. I think this is probably one of the more popular slides that we'll spend time on, because these are kind of the major players in the area that we see right now. It's not an extensive list, so please don't take this for face value. Definitely do some more research, but trying to put together a good list of who the players are. And I'll address the public space in a second here, but the programs on the left are programs that typically offer the boots on the ground program enrollment. They've got the agronomic expertise, they've got the relationships, they offer that value proposition to growers to enroll and say, come work with us on mitigating your emissions and turning them into credits that'll generate revenue for you. Typically, the program on the left is going to be partnered up with a market operator or a market provider on the right. That market provider operates because they have the MRV platform that we talked about to make the credit exchange happen. They're working with the verifiers. They're working to develop the protocol so that as easy as it can be to hand off that protocol to a farmer and say, follow these steps and you'll be ready to enter a market and exchange your credits on one of our platforms. And so typically a market operator is dancing with a program. So when growers get that contract, it's really important to read who's, as we say, who's who in the pew when it comes to partners that we're working with on that contract. A couple other things to note. I do have the providers split up as to nonprofit and private. The nonprofit Ecosystem Services Market Consortium, they are listed as that. When I work with growers, I particularly point out that that means that the fee schedule is going to be a little bit more transparent for what goes to operating costs of that market, as opposed to the private companies that have a prerogative to make a profit margin. So their fee schedule might be a little less transparent. It'll still be explicit in the contract of how much fees are associated with participating in the market. But they have a prerogative to make a profit margin in this. Couple other things, early adopters, those that have done conservation for at least 1 year or more. We don't really have a lot of solutions for early adopters when it comes to these markets. As of today, in order to participate in a market, you have to pick up a new practice. And so if you've been doing conservation, you have to contribute to this concept called additionality. And we'll dive way deeper into what that means and why. But we do have a few markets who are trying to compensate early adopters for the work they've done in the past. Land O'Lakes through Truterra, Corteva, and Bayer have all said that they want to try and offer a 5-year look back period where they will compensate up to 5 years for an early adopter who's taken on that practice. Now that requires all the data, all the receipts, all the information that they need to calibrate the model to compensate those 5 years. But if you have the information, that's one of the options that they're trying to provide to compensate early adopters. Last thing that I think I'll talk about on this slide when it comes to the players is Bayer Crop Science is the only one that's offering a pay for practice market. All the rest are operating as pay for outcomes markets. So Bayer will pay $3 for no-till strip till an acre, $6 an acre for cover crops, $9 an acre to do both. For a while, they were offering a $1 an acre bonus for 1,000 acres. So you could roughly make about $10 an acre to implement a practice. They would still come out and do the quantification and verification to continue to refine their program via their field view, but that they are the one that's unique in this space for what they are doing. In the public space, the Growing Climate Solutions Act obviously has a role in this. It's all about putting USDA at the center of information for what we're talking about with these private markets. Otherwise, I've heard the term, it's the Wild West out there. And so Growing Climate Solutions Act has Congress giving USDA the authority to bring everything together and be at the center of this. Also creating a certification program for third-party verifiers. That way, farmers who are interested in participating in this have a better idea of who those players are and who they can trust in that space. Again, right now, a lot of questions linger about that. It would also put an advisory committee at USDA that could be primarily made up of farmers to advise USDA on what roles they should play in this, if we could go that far, this public-private partnership concept that right now it's strictly in the private sector. And so what role does USDA or any other agency need to have in this space? That advisory committee would help with that. It passed the Senate last spring with a vote of 92-8. One of the few bipartisan bills that passed last year, and it was a climate bill for agriculture, so a pretty successful win there. Moving through the House and having conversations with House Ag Committee on how to improve that bill and make sure that it shows the value that it needs to have for producers who are looking at this space. The other two bullets are actually kind of related. The Food and Ag Climate Alliance, which American Farm Bureau is a co-founder of, it's probably one of the most unique alliances in Washington right now to put agriculture and 40 policies related to climate in the forefront of the conversation. Was a pretty large breakthrough. But one of the proposals that was part of that group was establishing a carbon bank at USDA and allowing the CCC to have funds to help with pilot projects that could help scale up some of these, not just carbon markets, and ecosystem services markets, but also some of those other voluntary market-based incentives that we talked about and putting public dollars towards that research. That has since then turned into the Climate Smart Agriculture and Forestry Partnership Initiative, where we've responded to the request for information on that and waiting to see the rules for what qualifies, as well as the notice of funding available to start applying for those dollars. So far, we've heard about $1 billion will be put towards that to implement public dollars into this space. And finally, I would be remiss if I didn't bring up the fact that these markets are going to have a conversation when it comes to the next Farm Bill, how rules work with Title II and conservation with these private markets, and are you able to participate in both? That's still a question. If you can get paid for an upfront practice from CSP and then get paid on the back end for participating here. Right now, the private industry drives that decision, and it depends on which one you're working with. But questions whether Congress will put limits to that, or if there are other mechanisms that will come through the Farm Bill that enable some of these things. All right, we spent plenty of time there. This chart, I only show merely as a symbol. I don't expect you to read it. I don't want you to use it, frankly, because it's already outdated. It was published December of 2020. By April of 2021, outdated. Most of the information had changed or had been amended. We already have, launch dates have changed, acreage enrollments have changed, payments have changed. A couple of these companies have changed their contract terms to be more amenable to farmers and ranchers, and have asked questions to growers that have considered it to say, what would be a better contract if we were to offer it. So don't spend too much time there. Where this is happening, and I've got kind of the irony of two different spots where this is happening. The darker shaded states are where many of the pilot projects are occurring right now, in order to better quantify the environmental benefits, better refine those tools, build those protocols, all of that. We've actually expanded a few of these states. I had an updated map the other day, so I haven't had a chance to shade in some more states, but they're trying to expand beyond row crops. And I think that's been the hardest part, is getting public dollars to expand beyond row crops and push to some of those specialty areas. But it's also happening on farm management software platforms. And I tell a lot of my producers, if you don't have one already, find one you're comfortable with, pick it and use it if you're interested in this. If you have 5, which a lot of times we do, pick one and consolidate information into one, because many of the carbon market and ecosystem services markets want to use the already existing farm management software platform in order to generate the data that they need for the models and to calibrate the quantification and all of that. So really important piece of the puzzle on that, and making sure that growers understand what they're signing up for when they use one of these, and then how that data can be shared into the carbon market. I've mentioned the word pilot projects a lot. I've mentioned protocols. That's really where we are when it comes to the development of this market. If you were to draw a market growth curve, we're still in that bottom concave. We've got a lot of hype, we've got a lot of hope, and we're still waiting to see how this develops up to the tippy top of the mountain. And so these protocols are being developed in order to make it easier for farmers and ranchers to enroll. Right now, I've heard an early estimate of 250 hours of computer work just to get everything set up. I've yet to meet a farmer that wants to spend 250 hours in front of a computer. So that needs to improve a little bit more, and protocols are a way that they're trying to make all of it easier, and so that it's pre-reviewed, it's pre-certified, information can be verified quickly, that sort of thing. Trying to better quantify the tools, or better try to better improve the quantification tools, if you will, excuse me. Many of my farmers say kind of the joke around soil sampling is, if you don't like what a soil sample says, walk 10 steps and take another one. And so really trying to better the processes and tools that we have available to do quantification, so that that is more accurate, and that more production systems can be a part of this, is another place that we're trying to better refine some of these. I do get a lot of questions about why we're even having this conversation, and beyond the promoting healthy soils and ecosystem functions, the improved water quality and conservation, all of that is very important. And I think most early adopters would tell you that's the biggest reason they did this, the agronomic benefits that it has. We're just starting to hear more and more about the greenhouse gas and climate benefits of reducing new emissions and removing past emissions. That's really driving that demand side for these markets. I point out to farmers and ranchers that if this works for you and you qualify and are eligible, this is a really great opportunity that could be a diversified revenue stream as we move through this. There's, again, a lot of hype, a lot of hope in the space, but if things go the way they say it's going to go, there are a lot of opportunities here. But it doesn't come without a lot of questions either. And so these are some questions that gathered throughout many talks with farmers and ranchers about this, and things that we're trying to put together as questions to ask these market developers too, of how are we going to address some of these. The top ones being the barriers of entry. We've talked a lot about verification. It's necessary for the standards in the market. We can't quite call this a market yet because we don't have broad spanning standardization. We have multiple different standards. So it's still technically considered an industry at that point. And so who's going to pay for this verification, and how much verification do we need in order to capture that? And so who pays for that? How much does it cost? It's a really big lingering question that sits out there and continues to linger because everybody's got to get on the same page of what standards they want in that verification. And farmers and ranchers continue to wait on that. Additionality and early adopters, I mentioned this, early adopters don't qualify, and they have to pick up a practice in addition to what they already do, that additionality clause, in order to qualify. And the best way I can describe it is, if you're a farmer who's done conservation, your baseline is here. You continue down the path that you are, not changing any of your practices, continuing conservation. You generate an environmental benefit that's of this margin and continue on your way. Your neighbor down the road has a baseline established down here because they've never touched conservation or anything. They pick up one practice, maybe two, similar to you, and generate an environmental benefit up to here. The amount of quantified credits that can come from that change is much larger and addresses the economies of scale issue that many of these market operators need in order to operate, and can generate and meet demand at a larger level. The other thing too is you have demand buyers out there that say, we need credits beyond the status quo. And early adopters contributing to the status quo. And in order to meet the needs that they have, they are demanding what you would call or consider new carbon. And so that's where that additionality piece comes in. So that's why I always tell growers up front, if this doesn't work for you, you don't qualify, look at some of the other options out there, because that's been a really big turnoff so far. Financial barriers are an interesting one. None of these market analyses were operating and developed and explored with 630 corn. They were all looking at 350 corn. So we have a very different farm economy that we're talking about as far as financial barriers, but we're also talking about a very different input cost structure. The cost of fertilizer has increased. The cost of land, rents have all increased. Not to mention, you look at cover crop seed, for example. The incentive to grow corn, soybeans, and wheat as you move westward, where most of our cover crop seed would be grown, was very high. Commodity prices were high. There's a huge incentive there. So you change your plan there. Not to mention, then they had a drought. So those that did grow cover crop seed, didn't have the quality of seed that maybe they've had in the past. And so you've got a lower supply and increased demand. And I have heard from a couple growers that their cost of cover crop seed went up this year. So we're not talking $10 or $12 an acre anymore, or $12 to $15. Talking $25 to $30 an acre. And that's not part of these initial market analysis of what growers could be paid in here. Another thing to consider is it would be laughable to think that we can continue down the path that we're going and support a market structure like this on the current state of rural broadband. You have to enroll online. You have to do all of your data management online. Any ag data precision tools that you're using have to be put into these systems via online. And if I hear one more story from a farmer of downloading their drone data in the McDonald's parking lot, that's not going to sufficiently hold up these markets. It just isn't. And so upgrading rural broadband to accommodate market structures like this is a huge barrier that we have to overcome. Not to mention education. Any person that has told you they picked up a new habit will tell you about the trial and error of that new habit. Any of you that said your New Year's resolution was going to the gym and you've been twice, I applaud you that you've been a little bit, but that trial and error of, we're hoping to go 3 times a week now. And you're just going to have that. And so some of those trial and errors do come with financial impacts, logistic impacts, any of those. Really big piece of that education, who's going to provide that technical assistance, that support, and just that encouragement along the way. A couple of these other questions I think are just some really big ones that linger out there. How will farmers be paid? Continues to be out there. Purdue University does their ag barometer and published their survey results earlier last spring. It said farmers who have signed a contract have been guaranteed $10 to $20 an acre for the credits that they generate. Okay, well, if that's where we're starting with, what are buyers paying for a credit and how much of a difference is that? Corteva did a survey later in the year that said most farmers ask for a minimum of $40 an acre. Again, that was before some of these financial barriers changed and some of these external financial factors changed, that maybe that needs to be higher. And again, what are demand buyers paying for a credit on their use? In Canada, they're talking about $130 a credit going for their market, which is about $175 in US dollars. How much of that comes back to the farmer? You look at the food dollar, farmers get about 8 cents of the food dollar. Are they going to get about 8 cents of the carbon dollar? And the questions to be addressed there. How will farmer data be protected? It's one of my biggest pet peeves of this, and I want answers about that. I think that's a very important question to ask, very important to address in this conversation. With new markets comes new regulations, and now the lingering question is, who will be that regulator? Many of the markets have said, well, we can do self-regulation. This is, an honor system. And my response to that is perfectly fine, but I have to find ways to protect and enable farmers and ranchers to participate in these. And right now, the best we have are the contracts that they sign. And why it's so important to read the contract and then have a lawyer read the contract and have 2 more lawyers read the contract. Because contract terms are all over the board and they're not written for farmers. There's questions about liability and access when you do sign that contract, and someone showing up on a farm within 24 hours notice saying, I'm here to soil sample. Hope you weren't planning to take cows to market that day because you've got 3 people out in your field soil sampling. Some of those things still linger. And the last 3 on here, I continue to ask what's realistic to expect. And I think that's important that growers continue to ask that when they're exploring a program, to have those frank conversations, to make sure that they're working with people that can keep their expectations level and realistic. The other thing too is making sure that you're working with someone that can be trusted, that you trust. That's something I tell growers all the time. My husband hates this, but I always say, you have to think of these contracts like you think about marriage, and that you're about to sign a long-term contract. You better know who that company is. You better trust them. You better be familiar with them and know who they work with and be comfortable with that decision before you sign the dotted line, because for the next 10 years, maybe even longer, you're married to them. And so it's really important that you trust that company as you're moving forward. And then we get questions weekly about X, Y, and Z, direct seeding versus overseeding, cover crop. Does it matter the width of strip till? All of those questions are things that it depends on which market you're working in and who you're working with, whether or not those matter. But I think as more people explore this, more and more questions come up. And so some of the big ones here. Lastly, before we head into the question and answer session, just want to put this out there. We do have this information and resources available on our website, on our Market Intel landing page. If you're not signed up for our Market Intel, feel free to sign up. It's free to members and non-members. We do a lot of economic analyses, anything from trade, taxes, livestock, crops, to sustainability, Western issues, EPA regulatory issues, all of that. That's really our place to put good information out for policymakers, members, and anybody else who needs it to get that information. So we put together this 5-part series on, the primer, kind of like what we talked about today, some of the practices that are under consideration and what that current snapshot is. Really speaking to who the early adopters are, where those are located, that sort of thing, because the best information we have right now is 2017 census data for practices that have been conservation practices that have been adopted. And so how do we find ways for us to improve that snapshot and show where early adopters are, and how we better accommodate those concerns is something that could be improved going forward. We do talk about those barriers that I mentioned in part 3. Part 4 compares that food dollar to the carbon dollar that I mentioned earlier. In part 5, just some good business practices and things to consider before signing that carbon contract. So with that, that is the end of my presentation, and happy to jump into a question and answer portion.
Great. That was a great presentation, and we do have some good questions here that were typed into the Q&A box. The first question has to do with that operational control issue that you mentioned, and it is, will farmers who rent land need to have the landowner sign the contracts?
Yeah, the quick answer is yes, absolutely. It has to be an open conversation. And you have to prove operational control as a tenant. And then if you rent from an LLC or a trust or anything like that, all of the landowners would then have to be signed off. Again, not a lawyer, but I can imagine if you had, the word's escaping me right now, but the one that would be the sole leader who has the right to speak for the entire entity, you likely could do that. But if farmland ownership issues have taught me anything, you tend to want everybody to sign off, not just the one person.
Exactly.
Shelby, thanks so much for your presentation. We've got a few more questions rolling in. Another one from Mark. Congress and USDA are beginning to move on this. When and where do you think state and local governments get involved? And just generally, do you think this is going to be a mainly federal issue that we're going to see action on, and less of a state-by-state issue, just in terms of the compliance piece and how complicated it can be?
Yeah, a lot of questions linger for state and local governments, and I think particularly it is what role I have so much empathy for states right now, because they want to be involved and they want a lot of they've got a lot of excitement for initiatives in this. But part of the issue is the economies of scale. I'm not sure we can reach economies of scale within a single state, that you need the broader scope, especially if you're in a state that's not going to generate nearly as many credits as, say, a Midwestern state or something like that. Just the nature of where our research is and the robust ability to sequester carbon that way. So for many states, a lot of the focus has been on how do we get our state NRCS staff up to speed to provide technical assistance? How do we put more money towards that technical assistance as a state agency? And what other mechanisms can we offer as a state to help incentivize participation in this? I've seen that's kind of on the tamer end. On the far end, I have seen states want to go a little bit further and try to get their state to be net zero. If we can capture our credits and keep them within the state to offset our manufacturing emissions, that sort of thing. Again, I don't know that the economies of scale are there to work, but I would love to find someone that could prove me wrong and maybe make that an option. But states are in a hard spot right now because they look at Congress and they say they're trying to do something, but even Congress, to an extent, hasn't been able to get their hands wrapped around it either. This is really developed solely on the private sector. You've got companies that aren't even based in the United States looking at the United States to say, we want to purchase your credits. So this is a global impact, not just a local, state, federal impact.
That's a fantastic summary. Thank you.
So Shelby, the next question we have gets to the additionality concept. Does the current uncertainty and requirement for additionality incentivize farmers to wait and see?
Additionality, I think, disincentivizes many of the early adopters from participating, that they might say, frankly, in some cases penalizes early adopters. And that has been addressed to the private sector to say, what about all of these folks that have already done this? I think the concept of additionality is frustrating for a lot of growers, and why they look at other mechanisms, why they're kind of waiting on USDA and plans that they have for conservation, and other ways to do that. You know, early adopters are that 20 to 30% that either figured out how to financially make it work early on or used USDA funding. And again, demand buyers are looking for that new carbon. So if they can't find that new carbon from getting that last 60% of growers who are still trying to figure out how to financially make this work, maybe that'll change the tides. What I have heard some of these, you know, the hesitancy for enrolling in markets that I've heard from these private market operators is that it's less of the early adopters that they've talked to and more of the new ones that are saying, well, I've been thinking about conservation for a while. I know I want to do it, but the finances haven't been there. I can't find the incentive, all of that. But maybe I want to, you know, take a less risky approach. This is all about risk aversion. Who feels like they can take the risk financially or you know, contractually or however their farm is set up. So maybe I want to enroll a smaller portion of acres into a program and see if I can grow with the market. And I have heard market operators, to the best of their ability, provide that advice of, if this is already on your mind, agronomically you're interested, don't worry about the additionality piece of it, but grow with the market.
We have another question related to the funding piece. Is there funding available to help farmers implement the farming practices? I know you touched on that a little bit, especially with the risk piece. And so do you think there's going to be any funding, you know, going down the road, you know, even in the Farm Bill?
Yeah, so we already have the extensive conservation title of the Farm Bill that provides, you know, the Conservation Stewardship Program funding, Environmental Quality Incentives Program. Those are the two working lands programs that offer cost share assistance for growers who are interested in this on the public sector. We have a whole lot of incentives, and I love whoever asked this because I feel like you just planted an opportunity for me to brag a little bit. But we just were part of a year-long study that explored some other innovative finance tools that could help incentivize adoption of conservation practices in the private sector. It's through Field to Market. If you haven't heard of them, we're a member. They cover obviously members all the way from grower field to market and food and brand retail. That report was just released Monday and talks about 12 mechanisms that we explored. There's probably hundreds more that we didn't get into, but the different levels of scalability, where private sector sits right now in that opportunity. So things like blended finance, risk management tools, the cover crop premium that USDA did is something that has caught a lot of traction too, of $5 an acre. Now I believe it's up to $25 an acre for implementing that. Talking to the ag finance community about what does, a 0.25% off an operating loan to do conservation. What does that look like in the grand scheme of things and how we do that? So there's so many options out there that if you don't qualify for a carbon market or an ecosystem services market, maybe you qualify for some of these other tools to help offset some of those financial costs. Happy to share that report too. We can get the link and send it out.
We can send that out with the recording. No, thank you.
Next question. I think we're still okay on time. The next question is, from a verification point of view, how often does that verification need to be done? And then on the issue of permanence, is there any permanence requirement past the kind of end date of these contracts?
Yeah, verification, and this is where I said, forgive me if I give this answer. Verification is going to depend on the market provider that you're working with. And why that is important is because the protocols that they're providing will depend on whether or not you verify every year or verify once a year, or how those credits are generated. Still kind of all over the board on what role third-party verification has, and as well as what the demand buyers need on that verification. But once a credit's verified, it's good to go. It's just the question of how many times does that need to go and be done. If that happens upon enrollment, it really depends on the market. And I would say the same answer about the permanence thing. I mentioned that contracts can be long-term contracts, 5, 10, 30 years. Some of them have an attached permanence clause that say you're going to sign up for 10 years, but you're also committing to 100-year permanence, which essentially means that at the end of the 10 years, you've been no-till, strip-till, whatever you choose, you are signing on to continue that practice through the duration of the 100 years to continue that carbon to be stored in a permanent manner. So enforcement on that is still a question that lingers as well as part of the contract. And I know Keith has been part of the group that has looked at contracts with us and helped explore how we get better terms for farmers and ranchers to advocate for better negotiated terms. But I think that's going to depend on the market.
Shelby, our next question from Jennifer Lanier with Land O'Lakes is, what is your perception of the impact if these markets move from private to a regulatory framework?
Oh, now she wants to know my crystal ball. And I don't know that I have a good concept for what happens. I unfortunately don't love the concept of being a self-regulated private market. Mostly because my job is to protect the interests of farmers and ranchers. And my biggest fear is running into an issue that we have in past instances with new ideas, may it be hemp, solar, wind, any of that, to say, you got in too early, you took the risk, and you were left holding the bag as a farmer. And I know there's a lot of farmers out there that have a bad taste in their mouth about whatever new venture they got hyped up into. I want to prevent that, because I think there are a lot of opportunities for farmers and ranchers to be part of this conversation, and I don't want a bad actor to ruin that. So if a regulatory framework were to come into play that helps protect and enable farmers and ranchers to participate in this market, so that we don't have a situation of bad actors leaving bad tastes and kind of turning everybody away from this concept, that would be my goal, as opposed to, telling private businesses what they should and shouldn't do. That would not go along with Farm Bureau policy, and mostly because we don't like other businesses telling us what to do either. So that's my sweet spot of a regulatory framework.
All right, another question, and I actually get asked this question quite a bit too. Do we know how much farmland is currently enrolled in these types of programs, or just the number of farmers? I mean, we know a lot of them have been focused on the Midwest, but there are a few folks doing this in North Carolina. But do you have a kind of general idea?
The Purdue Ag Barometer survey from last spring had an accurate number of that, and I'd have to look up the specifics of the survey respondents that they had. I want to say it was like 16% had signed a contract. Don't quote me on that number, though. We can look up the study and send it out with those materials as well. Back of the envelope, earlier last year, I had heard about 3 to 4 million acres. I think we've increased since then. I just don't have a good accurate reading on what that would be, and can maybe ask around and find out, but it hasn't been a lot.
Yeah, that's one of the hard things about private markets, is it's hard to get that private data.
Yep. I think all of my growers have that same issue with pesticide and fertilizer prices right now too.
Now we have a large farm as opposed to small, medium-sized farm question. And what models are being used to measure the actual carbon sequestration for various crops, notably industrial?
Yeah, so large versus small farms, that has evolved, and that's been a very interesting piece to watch evolve through this space. That chart that I showed you earlier, to begin with, many of the programs had acreage enrollment minimums, and some of those minimums were set at 500 acres, which, depending on where you are, is a very large farm. I know in our family farm, we would not enroll 500 acres. And there was been a lot of feedback to the industry to say 500 acres is a really big ask. And they weren't getting the enrollment response that they were hoping for. So we've seen many of them walk that back. I've seen as low as a 10-acre minimum. I think the sweet spot for many of them has been about 100 to 150 acres. And usually it goes by soil type, right? So you're going to take a tract of land and break it out by soil type and then enroll based on that. So very dependent on the market, but that's been where I've seen that the most. And then I'm sorry, the back end of the question was about quantification tools for cropping systems, correct? Okay. And industrial hemp being one of them. I'm not sure how robust the information and research has been on industrial hemp. But as far as the models that they're using out there, there's two right now that are leading the quantification space. One of them is the COMET tool, COMET, and that is based that's a USDA and Colorado State partnership, I believe. And then there's a second one that the name is escaping me right now that they're using. Keith, if you know it, help me out, but I can't remember. And from that angle, many of the market players that I've talked to that said that does a sufficient job for what we need to do it now. But we're already anticipating a new quantification tool that they'll use in the next 3 to 5 to 10 years, depending on how quickly that moves. So.
Yeah, Comet's the one that I'm familiar with as well. Yeah. Kind of next question here, kind of a supply demand question. You know, it seems like the demand for carbon credits is growing kind of from the corporate side. And obviously there's just a supply of who can produce them is limited right now. So it seems like that could make the price of carbon credits go up. I don't know that that's necessarily happening yet, but and then the other part of the question, is there a general published price for carbon credits through USDA or someone else?
Yeah, so we're certainly working off a finite supply. If you look at all the farmers and ranchers that we cut out early adopters. Well, let me put it this way. All the farmers and ranchers, we have limited it to a central geographic area where most of the robust research has taken place, and then we've cut out early adopters. So our target is this really small triangle right now of supply that it would be available. So absolutely a piece that's a player to this and where supply and demand happens. The general price that I've heard many people rely on is the California price, because they have a cap and trade system in place. Now, what that's going to run into is, again, that economies of scale piece where cap and trade system is going to exchange the finite supply and demand there and kind of play on a limit of economic market dynamics. But that's the best US price that I've seen. Canadian price has one. CME just had announced last fall that they were going to do a nature-based credit index that they would publish. That's not quite tracking supply and demand, but that's going to, track the sentiment and investment in that. So it might provide a little bit more transparency to a potential US price, but that's the best I've got so far, besides the rest of it being proprietary.
Shelby and Keith, I'm getting a 60-second warning. We want to be respectful of everyone's time. Shelby, thank you so much for the presentation, for your insight, and going through many questions. We got through 10 questions, all in-depth answers and analysis. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Any other closing comments? Any final thoughts?
I just thank everybody for joining. We had a good crowd log in. And so, yeah, great information and a timely topic for sure.
All righty. Well, thank y'all so much. Thank you for being here. After this webinar, you will find a brief survey, and we hope you found today's content valuable. You'll also see some future events coming up. We hope to see you there. Again, thank you again, and you will receive an email in the next 48 hours with a recording and information we talked about. Thank you all so much. Have a great rest of your day, and thank you for joining us.